We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You've probably heard these phrases before, but what did those words actually mean to the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence? I'm your host, Mercedes Musto, and I'm here in the studio today with Dr. Jacob Shively, and this is the FCLE Seminar Podcast. Listen, press play, and pass the Florida Civic Literacy Exam. Hey, welcome back, Dr. Shively.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Shively joins us from the University of West Florida, where he is the Associate Dean of the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities, and a professor in the Department of Government. Today, we are going to get into a founding document that is a must-know for the FCLE. That's right, the Declaration of Independence. Think the summer of 1776, we've got the Continental Congress, the brand new governing body of the 13 colonies, and a Virginia delegate named Richard Henry Lee. See, this guy basically introduces the idea of free and independent states. So Congress appoints a committee of 5 to draft a document explaining this idea to the world. That committee included John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and a lawyer from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson, who would do most of the actual writing. Wait a minute. Let me catch you up. I did say 1776, meaning this. 250 years ago, there were 13 British colonies ruled by King George III. There were tensions building between the British citizens here and King George III of Great Britain way over there. So why was the Declaration of Independence written?
Well, in brief, by the summer of 1776, the men of the Continental Congress had largely agreed that they had reached a point of no return. But let me turn the clock back a little bit here. For at least a decade, American colonists have been protesting for more equal standing in the British political system. Now remember, this is the period of no taxation without representation. In other words, American colonists felt like they were suffering rule and had no real voice in government to do anything about it or to change policies. Over time, both sides were getting more entrenched and less willing to compromise. Now, really, the real breaking point, I think, happened a year prior, in April 1775. The British military commanders in Boston, which had really become an epicenter of radical protests, sent troops to Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. Now, what they wanted to do is seize the colony's military supplies and try to calm things down. This is when, if you know the story, Paul Revere rode ahead of the British column, warning everyone that the British are coming. Now, the next day at Lexington Green was what's called the shot heard around the world. In other words, the first shots really fired in what became the American Revolutionary War. In the following months, there were a few full-scale battles like the one at Bunker Hill. So that's a lot of key words that you may have heard of in U.S. history. Some delegates at the Continental Congress over coming months did hold out some hope for a peaceful resolution. For instance, in August, they sent what's called the Olive Branch Petition. The king refused to even read it, though, and in fact, he issued a proclamation of rebellion, basically stating these guys need to be put down with force. At the same time, the Continental Congress was then passing a declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms. And when the colonists then heard that the king was hiring mercenaries from around Europe to fight in a war, they realized they were in a very new and very dangerous world. So back to 1776 and meeting in Philadelphia, most delegates understood that they were seen as traitors and basically a full-scale war was inevitable. If they were going to be fighting a war, they reasoned, for their rights to self-representation and free trade, if they would have to call upon their countrymen to sacrifice in this war, And if they hoped to attract international support, they figured they might as well make it official and declare independence.
Oh, wow. Off script here. Did you guys catch the We the People video featuring Dr. Shively at FCLE seminar on YouTube and TikTok? Man, it is something special. Before we move on to the meaning of the Declaration, I want to do something a little different. I want to read it to you because there's something powerful about hearing the key phrases of this document. The Declaration wasn't just printed in newspapers, it was read aloud in town squares to gathered crowds, to soldiers in the field. Hey, General George Washington had read it to his troops because these were words meant to be heard, meant to be felt, meant to be remembered. So I invite you, friend, to close your eyes for a moment and listen. Try to hear these words the way one might have heard them in the summer of 1776, the Declaration of Independence.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Beautiful, poetic, inspiring. Thank you, Dr. Shively. Most people are familiar with a few famous lines, but this document actually has 4 main parts and is packed with some phenomenal concepts I'd like us to cover. The 4 parts are Part 1, the preamble, the opening. Part 2, the list of grievances. Part 3, the statement of prior attempts at reconciliation. And 4, the formal declaration. So Part 1, the preamble. This is the famous philosophical opening. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Jefferson begins with a political philosophy, specifically grounded in the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers.
It really is one of history's most remarkable distillations of political philosophy. These few words summarize a fully developed and really radically new way to understand how all of us relate to one another, at least in politics. Remember that most cultures, societies, and governments assume hierarchies. Families, tribes, empires, and all the rest usually involve ultimate authority resting at the top. This is just how humans have seemed to organize themselves more often than not. Even when leaders assumed everyone is morally equal before God, for example, they assume that we cannot be of equal status on earth because they reasoned that would be chaotic. Imagine, for example, a kindergarten classroom in which every member had equal say. I have 4 kids, and I can assure you, and I'm sure you can imagine, that would be pandemonium. Now, over the millennia, most leaders assumed that's how democracy would function. It would be chaos. With this phrasing, though, Jefferson was drawing on what we might call cutting-edge thought. In the prior century, philosophers like John Locke had developed the concept of a social contract. They built this idea by imagining a world without shared culture, technology, or any other trappings of social life. Basically, you're stripping away everything we've built up over time and just trying to imagine humans on their own. This imaginary scenario is called the state of nature. Now, it's a lot of key words here, but the point for us is that when you take away everything that is built up around us over time, what is left, according to these philosophers, is us as individuals with crucially equal status. We're all in the world equally. So we enter, they would argue, under what's called social contract theory. In Jefferson's words, then, he's taking all of that concept and saying all men are created equal. This is running in the background of his words. Now, in that world, people have to work together to build security, cooperation, and eventually trust. It's a bit like dropping people from different backgrounds on a deserted island. Some of those folks might try to impose force, but these thinkers are assuming most would want to try to work out a peaceable arrangement for living together. It's a contract, but for society, a social contract. Now, one other piece here I want to mention is Benjamin Franklin's edit. Jefferson originally wrote that these truths are, as he said, sacred and undeniable in his first draft. Franklin, for various reasons, didn't care for that formulation. I suspect he, thought it might point to some other authority beyond the people. So he got out his red pen and marked out sacred and undeniable, and instead he inserted what we now know, self-evident. Once again, Franklin was likely thinking about Enlightenment scientists like Francis Hutcheson and Thomas Reed. These men argued that humans have a basic moral sense, as they called it, and based on that sense, some truths are so fundamental, and here's the key thing, that they are, self-evident. So you don't need to worry too much about the particulars of these names or their arguments. The point I'm trying to make here is that this concept, self-evident, really provides a simple answer to the question, how dare we claim individual rights? Well, we all dare because we're all equal, and that is self-evident.
I am absolutely enamored with these ideas, Dr. Shively. This was revolutionary thinking in 1776, and and to me, these ideas are still boldly spoken today. Part 2, the list of grievances. After the philosophical preamble, the Declaration shifts into what reads like a legal document. This is where Jefferson lists 27 specific grievances against King George III and the British government. The Declaration included grievances like how the king refused to assent to laws necessary for the public good, how he imposed taxes without the consent of the people, quartered British soldiers in private homes, and get this, the king had colonists transported overseas to be tried for pretended offenses. What?
I know. It sounds really dramatic, but it was real. Basically, British governors in the colonies were frustrated. They were frustrated that local juries among the colonists would not convict fellow colonists of crimes. For example, like seizing and burning ships that were used for tax enforcement, which was a real case in Rhode Island. So their solution was to threaten to send such cases to London. For the idea here is that this would ensure unsympathetic juries back in London and likely even death penalties for the colonists sent over there for a trial. Now, on the flip side, the 1774 Murder Act passed by Parliament was directed towards soldiers and other British leaders in the colonies who were accused of serious crimes like murder. It allowed officials to send those people, same thing, back to the UK, but for a trial that would certainly involve sympathetic juries rather than hostile juries, because these were, people from Britain rather than American colonists who might seem foreign to a jury in London. So it was kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card. Now, the larger story here is that this and many other accusations on the list that they generate for the Declaration illustrated how many colonists felt like they were living in a two-tiered system. They felt like they were supposed to be British citizens or holding equal rights to anyone else living in the UK. In reality, they felt like they were not being treated equally, and so they talked about what they call this long chain of abuses and usurpations. Now, a little note here, usurpation means claiming power that does not belong to you. A student claiming the right to change grades in a class, for example, would be usurping the teacher's basic power or rights. You're using someone else's power as your own. Now, for the Continental Congress, usurpation was a major sore spot. They felt like the British government had continually claimed or abused powers like taxation, criminal punishments, or limiting trade that ought to belong to the colonial and now the state governments. The Continental Congress wanted to stack up as many accusations as possible against the crown, against the king, to illustrate two things. One, that they were fully justified in what they were doing in this independence, and two, that this was an extreme case. They wanted to let other governments know, like in Paris, in Madrid, potential allies in a future war, that they need not fear American independence. They wanted to let their own people know as well that this was a safe or at least a justified action to declare independence. Now, one last note, this list only accuses the king, but not Parliament. That's actually a very deliberate political decision. By this point in history, Parliament was often just as important as, if not more important than, the monarchy in making laws. The colonials, however, thought it would be simpler to focus on one villain, the king. If you can identify a single individual, it's a lot easier to make your case. At the same time, Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense had become a runaway hit in the colonies. Paine argued that the divine right of kings was now an old and disproven concept. A people born free should not be subject to a king across the ocean. So all that background made it easier to pitch independence from the king. And finally, this approach, focusing on the king and not Parliament, might allow the colonists to get a few parliamentarians on their side. And the now famous conservative Edmund Burke, for example, was somewhat sympathetic to the arguments that the colonials were making.
Now, that's interesting. The second part of the Declaration wasn't just Jefferson philosophizing. He laid out a logical case for the right to revolution. But then there's part three. Part three, the statement of prior attempts at reconciliation. Before declaring independence, Jefferson acknowledges that the people had repeatedly tried to resolve these issues, these grievances, peacefully. They had appealed to the British Parliament, to fellow citizens, and even to the king. Listen, this independence thing wasn't taken lightly, and really, revolution was a last resort.
This one really is interesting because it does illustrate how this dispute between London and the Patriots often ran on two separate tracks. Basically, they were talking past one another. Many, if not most British, actually thought the colonists had moved from one completely unreasonable demand to another. And they were starting to initiate aggressive protests and arm for war. So they were thinking, who were these radicals demanding more and more from the government? For many British, including the king, they were genuinely baffled and angry that these colonials displayed so much ingratitude to a government that had protected them during a prior war, had helped pay for their development and pay for their infrastructure. Back on the American side, though, Americans of the Continental Congress were arguing that they had spent at least a decade raising valid concerns through accepted channels, and none of it got anywhere. So for them, as we mentioned, the Olive Branch petition was a classic case where they were trying to act in good faith, and the king immediately rejected it. The colonials took seriously the resort to violence, not only because they recognized that embroiling their countrymen in war is a profound responsibility, but they also wanted to be careful about the precedent that they were setting. As we've mentioned, most of the men of the Continental Congress were leading the new states. They were not exactly radicals. They were more interested in a political revolution than a social or an economic revolution. In social science, we sometimes make this distinction between overthrowing everything in society, kind of like the French Revolution, and making changes to your government or your governing style, which is closer to the American Revolution. So you've got two revolutions happening close to one another, but they actually look a little different when you dig into how much of a society is actually impacted. Now, in any case, a change in who governs makes a big change to who's in charge, but it doesn't necessarily overthrow the arrangement of how you do commerce, how you live in your local community, and so forth. So by exhaustively listing their efforts at reconciliation, the protests, the appeals to their British brethren, the letters to the king, the American founders wanted their readers to understand that in their minds, independence was the only remaining option, and they weren't trying to upend the world. They were trying to apply some new justice.
This is some really thick stuff here, and that's why we're talking about it, guys. Part 4, the formal declaration. Finally, the document reaches the actual declaration. Quote, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states." Here, with these words, the colonies formally announced their new and sovereign nation, brought into existence in 1776 with the pledge of their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to that cause.
Yeah, actually, as a foreign policy specialist, I am partial to this passage. It shows that the Declaration is simultaneously the first official act of the United States government, and it is a diplomatic geostrategic statement. Independence in the modern world, to give a little background, entails a couple of basics. One is sovereignty over your own affairs. This means that your government alone is responsible for making and enforcing the laws, deciding how to conduct trade and taxation, providing defense, and all the rest. Anyone in that government's territory is subject to that government's rule, and there is no higher authority. We don't have, for example, a world government. Now, the second basic element of modern independence is what international relations scholars might call mutual recognition. That simply means that other equal sovereign states acknowledge and respect your sovereignty. It's a club. If other people in the club agree that you're in the club, then you're good. And that's what the American founders were looking for. So for those founders, this piece was critical. We tend to forget now, but if France and Spain in particular had refused to acknowledge U.S. independence, military victory for the Americans might have been nearly impossible. Fortunately for their cause, the Patriots were reading the room, as we say. Both France and Spain had vested interests in seeing Britain's empire sliced in half, and they were eventually willing to devote massive resources to ensure that happened. Of course, the men placing their names to this document fully recognized that their signatures were a death warrant if they lost the war. The British government had categorized this as a rebellion, and the American patriots were traitors, announcing their intentions in a public document that would be shared across the colonies and the world. Like any group of people, these were not perfect men. Americans often treat the Founding Fathers, to be honest, as, legendary or even sacred figures. But we know that most of these guys were prosperous men with specific business interests that would probably benefit from independence. In a way, though, to me, knowing that reality enhances their reputation. Most of them were also principled men with a well-developed, if sometimes limited, theory of politics and government. They didn't just think independence was in their interest, in other words. They thought the new model of government they were developing would be just and really an improvement on old models. So, they were ordinary people attempting to build something extraordinary. At the moment of decision in 1776, and after years of building the case, they were willing to lay literally everything on the line for their cause.
I just keep thinking of the phrase, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. These men meant that literally. Signing the Declaration meant they were betting everything on the idea that they were doing what was good, right, and necessary. I mean, think about it. 56 men signed that document. They came from every walk of life. 56 men in the summer of 1776 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They signed the Declaration of Independence, and that changed the world.
It really did, and there are a few moments in history where you can really point to a single moment where people came together, signed a document, agreed, and moved forward, and you can trace the history of a state, of the people of Europe, of the rest of the world to that single moment. Now, there are a lot of other things happening in this period and a lot of other key moments in American and world history, but this clearly is one of those moments that will stand the test of time.
Hey guys, as you continue your studies, I encourage you to read the full text of the Declaration. We cover why we read old texts and classical education in a previous episode, so check that out. Listen, read our nation's founding documents slowly. Savor what freedom means. Think about the realities of 1776 compared to the realities of today, and then ask yourself, what does it mean to take these words seriously? That's where history comes alive. Let's review. Let's put 60 seconds on the clock for the document that started it all, the Declaration of Independence. Key takeaway number 1, Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft the Declaration of Independence in 1776, although a lawyer from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson would do most of the actual writing. This document was heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke. If you see Locke on the exam or on the civics test, think natural rights, think social contract. Key takeaway number 2, natural rights. See, Jefferson argued that we are born with inalienable rights, meaning no government can grant or take these away. But for the exam, know the big 3: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Key takeaway number 3, consent of the governed. That's right. The Declaration introduces the social contract. It states that governments are instituted to protect our natural rights and that governments only get their power from the consent of the governed, meaning the people. We, the people. Yes, hey, check out our We the People episode for more on that. So when you're staring down those exam questions, just remember a committee of 5 drafted it, Jefferson wrote it, Locke inspired it, and you are living it.
Yeah, and if I can add a few general points to help you remember this and hold it in context, the U.S. Declaration of Independence is very impressive for doing several things at once and all in a brief space. It is a political document making the case for the author's cause and why others should support their side. It is a legal document laying out the authority and justification of their claim to independence. It is a diplomatic document announcing their position to the world but assuring possible allies that the revolution poses no threat to them. And it is a personal document recording its signers' principled commitment to a cause that might cost them everything.
Thanks for joining us on FCLE Seminar Podcast. I'm interested in your thoughts on this freedom stuff. Hey, subscribe, share, and hit us up in the comments for some civic discourse. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. Until next time, keep asking those big, big questions and stay curious. This is your host, Mercedes Musto.
And Dr. Jacob Shively signing off.